The translator in my ear clicked twice before the Krasari ambassador finished his sentence, and that half-second told me everything I needed to know about how this meeting was going to go. My name is Elena Voss, and I was sitting at a table that had been built for beings with 4 arms and no patience, representing a species that the rest of the galaxy still measured in decades instead of centuries. 3 seats to my left, Counselor Vantik folded 2 of his 4 hands together and smiled with a mouth that was not designed to smile, and I felt the small hairs on my neck rise before he even spoke. "The human delegation will find," he said, "that the Council has been more than generous in this draft." I had read the draft. I had read it 4 times the night before, alone in a station cabin that smelled like recycled air and old metal. And generous was not the word I would have chosen. Fair was not the word either. I did not say either of those things out loud, because I had learned in my first month on this station that silence was often the sharpest tool in the room. Behind me, Daniel Cole shifted in his chair. Daniel was our youngest delegate, barely 30, sharp as a blade and twice as impatient, and I could feel the frustration coming off him in waves. I gave him a look without turning my head, the kind of look that said, "Not yet," and he settled, though his jaw stayed tight. The talks had been going on for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting at a table shorter than everyone else's. 6 weeks of watching our words pass through a translation system that somehow always made us sound less certain than we meant to be. 6 weeks of smiling at species who had spent 3 years watching our colonies burn and calling it a border dispute. I had stopped counting the small insults after the 2nd week. There were too many, and counting them only made the anger sharper, and anger was not useful here, not yet. The war itself had not been a border dispute. It had been an invasion, plain and simple, by a species called the Krasari, who decided that a scattering of human colonies on the edge of known space were undefended enough to take. They were not wrong about undefended. They were wrong about everything else. I remembered the first reports, back when I was still a junior officer running logistics out of a defense station near Earth. Colony after colony reporting contact, then reporting losses, then reporting silence. I remembered the Council's response, delivered through a junior functionary because no senior official thought the matter worth their own voice. Humanity was not yet a recognized stakeholder species, and therefore the Council could not intervene in what it called an internal territorial matter. Internal, as if our children being moved into detainment shelters on a rock at the edge of nowhere was an internal matter for someone else to decide. We fought anyway. Of course we fought anyway. What else was there to do? I looked around the table now, at the beings who had written us off 3 years ago and were now sitting across from us, discussing terms as if they had been on our side the whole time. Vantik continued speaking, his voice smooth as poured oil, laying out the treaty's benefits in a tone that suggested we should be thanking him. "Under this arrangement," he said, "the 3 colonies in the contested sector will fall under joint stewardship, administered by a council-appointed authority, ensuring stability for all species involved." Joint stewardship. I had circled that phrase in my notes the night before and written a single word beside it. Theirs. Because that was what it meant, stripped of the careful language. It meant the colonies our people had bled to defend, the colonies where children now went to school in buildings we had rebuilt with our own hands after the Krasari left them in ruins, would no longer belong to us. They would belong to a committee that had never set foot on those rocks, never buried anyone there, never spent 3 years wondering if the next transmission would bring news of survivors or silence. I kept my face still. I had trained myself for years to keep my face still, because a still face gave nothing away, and giving nothing away was the only advantage a species my size had at a table like this. "Counselor Vantik," I said, and the room's attention shifted toward me, the way it always did when the human delegation finally spoke, half curious, half amused, as if we were a novelty act that occasionally said something worth hearing. "Perhaps you could clarify what role human representatives will play in this joint authority." Vantik's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did, a small flicker that I had learned to recognize over 6 weeks of watching him lie, without technically lying. "Advisory capacity," he said. "A seat at the table, Ambassador Voss. Surely that is enough." A seat at the table. I almost laughed. We were already at the table, and it was shorter than everyone else's, and now they were offering us a smaller seat at a different table and calling it progress. Grace Bennett, seated 2 chairs down from me, was the delegation's youngest diplomat and the sharpest reader of a room I had ever worked with. She caught my eye for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw the same understanding pass between us that I had felt building for weeks now. This was not a peace treaty. This was a leash, dressed up in careful words and offered with a smile, and every day we sat here nodding along, made it easier for them to believe we would eventually put it on ourselves. The observer species assigned to mediate the talks, a quiet, insect-limbed people called the Asiran, had not once ruled in humanity's favor on a procedural question in 6 weeks. Not once. I had started keeping a private tally, more out of dark curiosity than any real hope of using it, and the number sat now at 0 for 41. 41 procedural rulings, every single one against us, on matters as small as speaking order and as large as which drafts entered the official record. I thought about the Krasari commander who had led the invasion, a being named Doran Vex, who was not even present at these talks because the council had decided his presence was not necessary for a peace agreement concerning the war he started. I thought about the human pilots who had died stopping his fleet from reaching a colony that housed 11,000 civilians. I thought about the fact that not one council representative had ever visited that colony, had ever spoken to a survivor, had ever seen with their own eyes what 3 years of fighting for a rock at the edge of nowhere actually looked like up close. And I thought, sitting there with my face perfectly still while Vantik smiled his careful, oily smile, that these people had absolutely no idea who they were negotiating with. "We will need time to review the specific language of the Joint Authority Clause," I said, keeping my voice level, giving away nothing. The human delegation requests a recess before further discussion. Vantik's 4 hands, spread in a gesture I had come to recognize as reluctant agreement, dressed up as generosity. "Of course, Ambassador. We are, as always, patient with our newer members." Newer members. 3 years of war, thousands of lives, entire colonies rebuilt from ash with human hands and human will, and to him we were still newer members. A phrase that managed to be both condescending and completely, deliberately wrong, because we had not asked to join anything. We had simply survived something the council refused to help us survive, and now they wanted credit for the peace that followed. I stood, and my delegation stood with me, and we walked out of that chamber in careful, measured steps, the kind that gave nothing away. But inside, something had shifted. I had walked into that station 6 weeks earlier believing, despite everything, that this process was meant to end fairly. I walked out of that session finally understanding what my father used to tell me before I ever left Earth's orbit, a piece of advice I had carried without really believing it until this exact moment. He used to say that people who write you off will always be surprised when you survive them, and they will spend the rest of their lives trying to prove they were right about you all along. The corridor outside the chamber was long and quiet, lined with windows that looked out onto the black nothing between stars, and Daniel fell into step beside me, his jaw still tight, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "They're not negotiating with us," he said. "They're managing us." "I know," I said. "How long have you known?" I looked out the window at the distant scatter of light that was, somewhere far beyond it, home. "Since the 3rd day," I said. "I just needed to be sure." Behind us, through the closed chamber doors, I could hear Vantik's voice continuing, still smooth, still patient, discussing the treaty's finer points with delegates from 3 other species who had never once had to fight for anything they now sat comfortably enjoying. I did not go back in immediately. I stood at that window a moment longer, thinking about the 11,000 civilians on a colony none of these people had ever visited, thinking about the pilots who never came home, thinking about a war we won without anyone's permission and a peace they now wanted us to accept on their terms. Grace joined us a moment later, arms crossed, watching the same black nothing I was watching. "What do we do?" she asked. I did not answer right away. I was still turning the shape of an idea over in my mind, an idea that had been forming quietly for 6 weeks, and had just, in this last hour, finished taking shape. "We keep watching," I said finally, "and we wait for them to show us exactly how little they understand." I did not know yet how soon that moment would come. But I had a feeling, standing there in that quiet corridor with the stars scattered beyond the glass, that it would not be long, and that when it came, this station, this council, and every smiling ambassador seated at that too-short table would remember it for a very long time. The recess gave us 3 days before the next session, and I spent the first of those days doing something I had not let myself do in a long time. I pulled up the old logistics files from the early months of the war, back when I was still a junior officer running supply lines out of a station near Earth, back before anyone called me an ambassador or trusted me to sit at any table at all. I remember the exact moment the first contact report came through. It was early morning on the station, and the duty officer who brought it to me had a face gone pale in a way I had never seen on him before. A colony called Meridian Hold, out on the edge of settled space, had reported unknown vessels entering its system. Then, 4 hours later, it reported losses. Then, 6 hours after that, it reported nothing at all, because the transmitter had gone dark and stayed dark. I did not know then who the Crisari were. Almost none of us did. They were a name in a database, a species the Council had briefly mentioned in passing during one of the early contact meetings, filed somewhere between minor trade partner and unknown quantity. We learned who they were the same way we learned almost everything in those first terrible months, by losing people and reading the wreckage afterward. I flew out to Meridian Hold myself 6 weeks after the first attack, once the fleet had scraped together enough ships to mount a relief effort. I was not supposed to be on that ship. I had argued my way onto it anyway, because I had family who had transferred out that way 2 years before, and I needed to see with my own eyes what had happened. What I saw was a colony half burned and half frozen, its atmospheric shields down, its main dome cracked open like an eggshell, and 11,000 people who had survived by sealing themselves into a maintenance shelter never designed to hold more than 400. I remembered the smell of that shelter when the doors finally opened, the sound the children made when they saw sunlight again, the way one woman, a teacher named Laura Bishop, had organized shifts among the survivors to ration air and water and hope in equal measure for 6 straight weeks without a single working communication line to the outside. Laura Bishop became one of my closest friends after that. She still ran a school on that same colony, rebuilt now, with windows that let in real light and doors that opened without anyone holding their breath. I thought about her often during those 6 weeks of talks, wondering what she would say if she could see the language in that treaty draft. The phrase, joint stewardship, applied so calmly to the ground she had once kept 11,000 people alive on with nothing but discipline and stubborn will. The Council, when we finally reached them through back channels in those early months, gave us an answer that I have never forgotten and never will. Humanity was not yet a recognized stakeholder species under galactic law, and therefore the Crisari incursion fell under a category the Council termed an internal territorial matter, not subject to Council military intervention. I remember reading that response for the first time and thinking there must be some mistake, some translation error, because surely no civilization capable of building starships and appointing councils could look at what was happening to Meridian Hold and call it internal. There was no mistake. The message was clear, and it was final, and it told us in the plainest possible terms that we were on our own. So, we fought on our own. I will not pretend it was clean, or easy, or heroic, in the way old stories make war sound. It was ugly, and slow, and expensive, in every currency that mattered: blood, and money, and time, and sleep. We did not have council-grade shielding technology. We did not have their long-range sensor arrays or their fleet coordination systems. What we had was an old, stubborn habit of refusing to accept a battle as lost simply because someone with more experience told us it was. I remember a fleet analyst from a neutral species observing our early defense of the outer colonies purely out of academic curiosity, telling me flatly that our tactics defied every established model of engagement. He meant it as a kind of insult, or perhaps a warning, the way you might tell a child that a bridge cannot hold their weight. What he did not understand, what none of them seemed to understand, was that we had never been given the luxury of trusting established models. Every model available to us predicted our defeat. We simply declined to follow the script. There was a battle near a colony called Farron's Reach, 8 months into the war, that I think summed up everything the Council never understood about us. A Cresari strike group, 12 ships strong, moved to take the colony in what their own commander, a man named Doran Vex, apparently described afterward as a routine operation. Our defense force numbered 4 ships, 2 of them barely flight-worthy, crewed by pilots who had been civilians 18 months earlier. By every reasonable measure, Farron's Reach should have fallen in under an hour. It held for 11 days. I spoke, years later, with one of the surviving pilots from that defense, a man named Marcus Hale, who told me the story in a voice so plain and unbothered that it took me a moment to understand the scale of what he was describing. He said they simply refused to stop flying. Not out of some grand sense of destiny, he was careful to say, but because stopping meant the colony fell, and the colony falling meant people he had grown up with would not survive the week, and he found, in the moment it mattered, that he could not accept that outcome, regardless of what the numbers said was likely. Doran Vex eventually pulled his strike group back from Farron's Reach, not because he was defeated in any conventional sense, but because the cost of taking it had become, in his own later reports, unacceptable relative to the value of the target. He had run the numbers the way every trained tactician runs numbers, weighing losses against gains, and by every rational measure he should have won easily and cheaply. He had not accounted for the fact that the people defending Farron's Reach were not running the same numbers he was. They were running a different equation entirely, one that did not include the option of losing. This, I came to understand slowly over 3 years of war, was the thing the Council's analysts never adjusted for in their models. They measured us by fleet size and technology level and casualty tolerance thresholds pulled from 1,000 years of galactic conflict data involving other species entirely, and every single time we broke the curve. Not because we were stronger, not because we were smarter, because we simply refused, again and again, to behave the way the math said we should. I remember reading a council briefing document late in the 2nd year of the war, one that had been leaked to us through a sympathetic trade contact, in which their own fleet analysts admitted, almost with a note of academic frustration, that human combat behavior consistently fell outside all established predictive models and recommended further study before any formal alliance consideration. Further study, as if we were a curious anomaly to be examined at leisure rather than a species actively bleeding to defend children, the analysts themselves had written off as already lost. By the time the war reached its 3rd year, the Cresari had lost enough ships, enough territory, and enough political standing at home that their own government finally reached out, not to the Council, but to us directly, requesting terms. It was only then, once the fighting had effectively already ended on the ground, that the Council suddenly discovered a great deal of interest in mediating the peace. Suddenly we were worth a seat at a table. Suddenly our representatives were being invited to a station none of us had ever been permitted near during the actual war. I sat with that thought for a long time during those 3 days of recess, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is living underneath it. The Council had refused to help us, when help would have saved thousands of lives. They had called our survival an internal matter when it suited them, and now, having contributed nothing to the fighting or the dying, they wanted to write the terms of the peace as if they had been the ones holding the line the whole time. Grace found me on the second day of the recess, sitting alone in the station's small observation deck, still turning over old reports on a datapad that had become, over 3 years, something like a private ledger of everything the council had gotten wrong about us. "You're doing that thing again," she said, settling into the seat beside me. "What thing?" "Building a case." She glanced at the datapad. "You've been building a case since the first week." I did not deny it. "Someone should," I said. "Because in 3 days, they are going to hand us a treaty designed by people who have never once had to run the numbers the way we ran them, and they are going to expect us to be grateful." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the stars scatter past the window. "And if we're not grateful?" I thought about Laura Bishop rationing air for 6 weeks in a shelter built for 400. I thought about Marcus Hale flying 11 days over a colony the Krasari commander himself considered already won. I thought about every model the council had built to predict us, and every single time we had broken it without meaning to prove anything at all, simply because breaking it was the only way any of us knew how to survive. "Then," I said, "they are finally going to learn the one thing about us they never bothered to study properly." "Which is?" I closed the datapad and looked out at the dark scatter of distant light, thinking of home, thinking of everyone who was not in this room to hear it, decided for them. "That we were never asking for their permission to survive," I said. "We were only ever asking them to notice, and it is far too late now for them to pretend they did." The recess ended the next morning. I walked back into that chamber, with the datapad tucked under my arm, my face perfectly still, and I did not yet know exactly how the next session would end. But for the first time in 6 weeks, I was not dreading it. I was simply waiting to see if they had learned anything at all in 3 days, or whether they were about to prove, one final time, exactly how little they understood about the species sitting across their table. The chamber felt different the moment I walked back into it, though I could not immediately say why. Perhaps it was the way Counselor Vantik's smile had a fraction more confidence in it, the way a man smiles when he believes a matter has already been settled and the remaining conversation is only a formality. Perhaps it was the way the Osseran observer, seated in his usual quiet corner, avoided my eyes entirely instead of offering his usual polite, empty nod. Whatever it was, I felt it before a single word was spoken, and every instinct I had sharpened over 3 years of war told me the same thing at once. Something had changed while we were away, and it had not changed in our favor. Daniel leaned toward me as we took our seats. "They rewrote something," he said quietly. "I know." Vantik did not waste time on pleasantries. He rarely did once he believed the outcome was secure, and I had learned to read that particular efficiency as a warning sign in itself. He gestured, and a new document appeared on the shared display above the table, its text scrolling in 6 languages at once, human text rendered small and slightly delayed compared to the others, as it always was. "The Council has reviewed the delegation's concerns regarding the Joint Stewardship Clause," he said, "and in the spirit of cooperation, we have revised the language to provide additional clarity." Clarity. I had come to understand, over 6 weeks, that whenever Vantik used that word, it meant the opposite. I scanned the new draft as quickly as I could, my eyes moving faster than the translation system could keep pace with, and by the 3rd paragraph my stomach had gone cold, in a way it had not gone cold since the earliest, worst days of the war. The original draft had proposed joint stewardship over 3 contested colonies, administered by a council-appointed authority, with human representatives serving in an advisory capacity. That had been bad enough. This new draft went further. Buried in careful, technical language, in a section labeled Sector Stability Provisions, was a clause that placed independent human fleet command in the entire contested sector, not merely the 3 colonies, but the surrounding space itself, under the authority of a newly created council body called the Regional Stability Command. I read it twice, to be certain I was not misunderstanding the translation. I was not. Under this new provision, any human vessel operating in that sector, including our own defense fleet, the fleet that had bled for 3 years to hold that ground, would require clearance from a multi-species authority before engaging any threat. Our ships, our sector, our dead. And under this new language, we would need permission to defend any of it. I did not look up immediately. I kept my eyes on the display a moment longer, giving myself the time I needed to master the anger rising in my chest, because I understood, with total clarity, that the next several minutes were going to matter more than anything that had happened in the previous 6 weeks combined. "This clause," I said finally, and I was proud, afterward, of how steady my voice remained, "was not part of any draft the human delegation has previously reviewed. It is a refinement," Vantik said smoothly, "developed in consultation with several council members concerned about stability in a sector with a documented history of unpredictable engagement patterns." Unpredictable engagement patterns. I understood immediately what he meant, because I had read the same phrase in that leaked briefing document years earlier. He meant us. He meant the fact that we had refused to lose battles the Council's own analysts had calculated we should lose. He meant that our willingness to fight past the point every reasonable model said we should stop had become, in the eyes of the Council, not a strength to respect, but a risk to contain. Grace's hand found the edge of the table, her knuckles pale, though her face remained composed. Daniel was not so composed. I could feel the heat coming off him from 2 seats away, and I placed a hand briefly on the table between us, a small gesture that asked him, without words, to let me handle what came next. "Councillor Vantik," I said, "you are asking humanity to surrender independent command of its own fleet, in a sector that human forces defended alone for 3 years, to an authority that did not exist during a single day of that fighting." "The war is over, Ambassador," Vantik said, his tone taking on the particular gentleness people use when they believe they are being patient with someone who has not yet grasped the obvious. "Peace requires structures the war did not require. Surely you understand that continued independent military authority in a contested sector, held by a single species with, as I say, an unpredictable engagement history, presents an unacceptable risk to long-term Council stability." "An unacceptable risk," I repeated. "Precisely." I looked around the table then, slowly, deliberately, letting my gaze pass over every delegate seated there, species who had watched our colonies burn from a comfortable distance and called it an internal matter, species who had waited until the fighting was effectively finished before discovering any interest in the outcome, species who were now, in this very room, attempting to write themselves into command of ground they had never once risked anything to defend. I thought of Laura Bishop rationing air in a shelter built for 400 people, while 11,000 waited in the dark. I thought of Marcus Hale flying 11 straight days over Farron's Reach because stopping was simply not an option his mind would accept. I thought of every pilot who never came home, every family that received a message with no body to bury, every single one of them, written off in advance by analysts in this council, who had decided, long before the first shot was fired, that our survival was not their concern. And I thought of my father's voice, the one piece of advice I had carried, without truly believing, until the exact moment, sitting in that chamber, staring at a clause that would have handed away everything those people had died defending. People who write you off will always be surprised when you survive them. "Councillor Vantik," I said, and something in my voice must have carried further than I intended, because the low murmur of side conversation around the table went suddenly, completely silent. "I would like to ask you a direct question, and I would appreciate a direct answer." He inclined his head, still smiling, still certain of the outcome. "Of course, Ambassador. During the 3 years my species fought to hold that sector, how many Council vessels were deployed to assist in its defense?" A pause. Small, but real. "The Council maintained a position of neutrality during the conflict, as is standard practice in matters not yet." How many, I said, were deployed? Another pause, longer this time. None, he admitted, and I heard, for the first time in 6 weeks, a note of something other than smooth confidence in his voice. How many council representatives visited Meridian Hold, or Farron's Reach, or any of the 11 other colonies attacked during that war, at any point during the fighting, or in the 3 years since? Silence. None, I said, answering for him. Not one. Not a single representative of this council has ever set foot on ground that my people bled to hold, and yet here we are, in this chamber, discussing language that would place that same ground under an authority created entirely by people who never once risked anything to defend it. Vantik's composure had not broken, not entirely, but I could see the shape of it straining, the way a hull strains under pressure it was not built to withstand. Ambassador Voss, I understand the emotional weight of this history for your people, but emotion cannot be the basis of galactic policy. The Council must consider stability for all member species, not merely the interests of one. Stability, I said, and I let the words sit in the air a moment before continuing. Counselor, do you know what actually created stability in that sector? It was not this council. It was not any policy written in this chamber. It was 11 days of pilots refusing to stop flying over a colony you had already, in your own analyst's documents, written off as an acceptable loss. It was a teacher rationing air for 6 weeks in a shelter meant for 1/10 as many people as she kept alive. Stability in that sector was purchased entirely by human blood, human discipline, and human refusal to accept the numbers your own experts told us were final. I could feel Daniel beside me, sitting perfectly still now, and Grace across from me, her eyes fixed on Vantik with an intensity that would have made a lesser man look away. And now, I continued, you are asking us to hand command of that same ground to a body that did not exist for a single day of the fighting that secured it, on the grounds that our engagement patterns are, in your words, unpredictable. I would suggest, Counselor, that unpredictable is simply the word your analysts use for a species that refuses to lose when your models say it should. The room had gone entirely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against the walls. Even the Osseran observer, who had not once looked directly at a human delegate in 6 weeks, was watching me now, his many small eyes unmoving. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I have heard the story told differently since, dramatized, exaggerated, turned into something louder than it actually was. I did not shout. I did not threaten in the way threats are usually understood. I simply closed the datapad in front of me, the same one Grace had caught me building a case on 3 days earlier, and I stood. The human delegation withdraws from these talks, I said, effective immediately. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it, sharper, more startled. Vantik's 4 hands, for the first time in 6 weeks, did not move in any smooth, practiced gesture. They simply sat, motionless, on the table in front of him. Ambassador, he said, and his voice had lost its smoothness entirely now, I do not believe you understand the consequences of such a... I understand them completely, I said. Let me be equally clear about what happens next, so there is no confusion in the official record. I looked directly at him, and then, deliberately, at every other delegate seated around that too-short table, giving each of them a moment of my full attention before continuing. Humanity will continue to defend the sector its people bled for, under its own command, using its own fleet, answering to its own authority, exactly as it has done for the past 3 years, without a single council vessel ever arriving to help. Any council or regional stability command vessel entering that sector without direct human authorization will be treated with precisely the same response our forces gave the Crisari when they first arrived uninvited. A murmur broke out around the table, then, quiet but immediate, a ripple of alarm passing through delegates who had spent 6 weeks treating us as a problem to be managed, and were now, for the first time, hearing exactly what happened when that management failed. You would risk renewed conflict, Vantik said, over a matter of administrative structure. No, Counselor, I said. I would risk nothing at all. We have already fought and won a war to hold that ground. What I am telling you is that we are not willing to hand over, at a negotiating table, what we were not willing to surrender on the battlefield. There is a difference, and I would encourage the Council to study it carefully, because I do not believe your analysts have accounted for it in any of their models. I picked up the datapad and stepped back from the table, and Grace and Daniel rose with me, and behind them, the rest of our small delegation rose as well, chairs scraping quietly against the floor in a chamber that had gone almost unnaturally still. Vantik rose too, finally, his composure fractured in a way I had never seen in 6 weeks of watching him. Ambassador Voss, I would ask you to reconsider. This body has invested considerable effort in reaching an agreement that serves the interests of galactic stability. Then perhaps, I said, the Council should have invested that same effort 3 years ago, when the outcome of that investment would have been measured in lives saved rather than clauses negotiated. I did not wait for a response. I turned, and my delegation turned with me, and we walked out of that chamber the same way we had walked into it, in careful, measured steps that gave nothing away, though everything inside me was moving faster than I let my face show. The corridor outside was long and quiet, the same corridor I had stood in 3 days earlier, looking out at the same scatter of distant stars. Daniel exhaled hard, a sound somewhere between disbelief and something close to relief. You actually did it, he said. I did, I said. Do you know what happens now? I looked out at the black nothing beyond the window, thinking of Laura Bishop and her school full of children who now studied under real light, thinking of Marcus Hale and every pilot who had refused to stop flying, thinking of every colony the Council had never once visited and never once helped defend. I know exactly what happens now, I said. For 6 weeks, they have been deciding what happens to us. For the first time since this entire process began, we just decided something for them. Behind the closed chamber doors, I could hear voices rising, no longer smooth, no longer careful, no longer certain, and for the first time in 6 long weeks, that sound did not worry me at all. News travels strangely on a station built by a dozen different species, each with its own sense of urgency and its own sense of time. Within an hour of our walkout, I learned later, the Council had convened an emergency session behind closed doors, one that no human delegate was invited to observe, though word of what happened inside reached us anyway, carried through the same back channels that had once brought us that leaked briefing document years earlier. I spent that first hour in our delegation's small quarters, not celebrating, because there was nothing yet to celebrate, but simply sitting with Grace and Daniel and the rest of our small team, running through every possible consequence of what I had just done. Daniel wanted to know if I regretted it. Grace wanted to know what came next. I found, sitting there with both of them watching me for an answer, that I regretted nothing at all, and that what came next was not entirely in our hands to decide. The first sign that something had genuinely shifted came not from the Council itself, but from the Crisari delegation, who had been present at the talks as the other party to the original conflict, sitting quietly through 6 weeks of proceedings that had increasingly treated their war with us as a settled matter, requiring only Council-approved paperwork. Their senior representative, a careful, quiet man who had said very little throughout the entire process, requested a private meeting with our delegation less than 2 hours after our walkout. I almost declined. I had no particular trust for anyone connected to a war that had cost us so much, and the last thing I wanted, in the hours immediately following such a significant decision, was to be maneuvered into another conversation designed to serve someone else's interests. But something in the request felt different from Vantik's careful diplomatic language, and after a brief conversation with Grace, who agreed there was little to lose in simply listening, I accepted. The Crisari representative arrived alone, without aides, without the careful staging that had characterized every Council interaction for 6 weeks. He introduced himself simply as Doran Vex, and it took me a moment to place the name, and when I did, my hand tightened involuntarily around the edge of the table. "You commanded the strike group at Farron's Reach," I said. "I did," he said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to soften what that meant. "I commanded several operations during that conflict, Ambassador. I am not here to apologize for a war my government chose to fight and eventually chose to end. I am here because I believe you and I may be the only two people on this station who fully understand what actually happened during those 3 years, and I think that understanding may now be useful to both our peoples." I said nothing for a long moment, studying him, searching for the calculation I had learned to expect from every other delegate on this station, and finding, to my genuine surprise, something closer to simple honesty. "Go on," I said. "My government pursued this war, believing your colonies would fall within months," he said. "Our own analysts, drawing on centuries of Council conflict data, predicted total collapse of human resistance in the contested sector inside a single year. We revised that estimate 7 times over 3 years, and each revision was wrong in the same direction. We did not lose this war because your fleet outmatched ours in any conventional sense, Ambassador. We lost because we could not calculate what your people were willing to accept as an acceptable cost, and every model we built on other species' history failed to predict yours." It was strange, hearing from the mouth of the man who had ordered the attack on Farron's Reach, the same conclusion I had spent 3 years reaching on my own. Stranger still was the fact that hearing it from him carried a different weight than hearing it from any Council analyst, because he had been the one running the numbers in real time, watching them fail in real time, adjusting them again and again as our stubborn refusal to accept defeat kept breaking every prediction his own people trusted. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, instead of during 6 weeks of talks where it might have actually mattered. "Because during those 6 weeks," he said, "the Council was writing the terms of a peace that served the Council's interests, not mine and not yours. My government wants this war finished, Ambassador. We have no further appetite for a conflict that has already cost us more than we anticipated in every possible way. But we have watched this Council attempt to write itself into control of a sector neither of us actually ceded to it, and we have decided that we would rather negotiate a lasting peace directly with the people who actually defeated us than continue pretending a body that contributed nothing to this war has any right to determine its resolution." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I had turned over so many other things during those 6 weeks, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I believed him. "You are proposing direct talks," I said. "Outside the Council's process entirely. I am proposing exactly that," he said. "Your walkout this morning has created a rare opportunity, Ambassador. The Council's authority over this process depended entirely on both parties continuing to treat it as necessary. You have just demonstrated, quite publicly, that it is not. I thought about that conversation for a long time after he left, and I found myself understanding something I had not fully grasped even in the moment I stood up and closed that datapad in the chamber. The Council's power had never actually come from any real strength, military or otherwise. It came entirely from the quiet, ongoing agreement of every species at that table to pretend the Council's rulings mattered more than they actually did. The moment one species stopped pretending, loudly and publicly, the entire structure had nowhere solid to stand. Word of the Crisari's private approach reached the Council within a day, and the reaction, from what I understood through the same back channels, was something close to genuine alarm. A war they had contributed nothing to ending was now being resolved without them, by the two parties who had actually fought it, and the treaty they had spent 6 weeks carefully constructing to place human military authority under Council oversight was rapidly becoming irrelevant to everyone except the Council itself. 3 days after our walkout, Councillor Vantik requested a private meeting of his own, and this time I did not hesitate at all before accepting, because I wanted, more than almost anything else during that entire process, to see his face when he no longer had a room full of allied delegates to perform for. He arrived without his usual careful composure, though he tried, in the first few minutes of our conversation, to reconstruct it. He spoke of stability, of precedent, of the delicate balance the Council maintained across 1,000 years of galactic governance, and I let him speak for a while, because I had learned that people often reveal more in the moments before they finally ask the question they actually came to ask. Eventually, he stopped, and something in his posture shifted, and when he spoke again, his voice had none of the smoothness it carried in that chamber. "Do you understand what you have done, Ambassador?" I considered the question carefully, because I did not think he was asking it rhetorically, and I wanted to give him an honest answer rather than a satisfying one. "I understand it completely," I said. "The question, Counselor, is whether you do. This Council has governed relations between member species for 1,000 years, he said. A single walkout does not undo 1,000 years of established order. No, I said, it does not. But 1,000 years of order, built on the assumption that every species at your table needs your permission to survive, was always going to break the first time a species discovered it did not need that permission at all. We did not discover that today, Counselor. We discovered it 3 years ago, the first time your council told us our survival was an internal matter not worth your attention. We simply never had a reason to say it out loud until now. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something settle in his expression that I had not seen in 6 weeks of careful, practiced diplomacy, something closer to genuine uncertainty. The Crisari have requested direct talks with your delegation, he said finally. It was not a question. They have. And you intend to proceed with those talks, regardless of this council's position on the matter. We intend, I said, to finish a war we started finishing 3 years ago, on our own, without anyone's permission. We are simply choosing, this time, to finish it with the party who actually fought it against us, rather than a body that watched from a comfortable distance and arrived only once the fighting was already over. Vantik did not respond to that immediately. He sat for a long moment, his 4 hands still, his careful smile entirely absent, and I found myself, watching him, thinking not of anger, but of something closer to simple clarity. This was a man who had spent 6 weeks believing he held every advantage at that table, and he was only now beginning to understand that the advantage he believed he held had never actually existed. It had only ever existed as long as we agreed to act as though it did. "What do you want, Ambassador?" he asked finally, and there was something almost plain in the question, stripped of its usual diplomatic weight. What would it take for your delegation to return to this process? I thought about that question for a long moment, because it was, in its own way, the first honest question anyone at that table had asked me in 6 weeks. I want this council to understand something it has never had to understand before, I said. We were never asking for a seat at your table because we needed one. We asked because we believed, for a long time, that a fair process was worth more than the alternative. You spent 6 weeks proving to us that the process was never fair, and in doing so, you taught us something we should perhaps have learned 3 years ago. That the only peace worth having is one we negotiate as equals, not one handed to us by people who never risked anything to earn a voice in it. I stood then, and I did not wait for his response, because I did not believe, in that moment, that any response he could offer would change what had already been set in motion. Behind me, as I left that private meeting, I heard him say something quiet, almost to himself, something I was not certain I was meant to hear at all. We never accounted for this, he said, not once, in 1,000 years. I did not turn back. I simply walked out into the corridor, toward the window that looked out on the same scattered stars I had stood before 3 days earlier, and I found myself thinking, not of victory, because it did not feel like victory yet, but of something quieter and steadier settling into place. The Council had spent 1,000 years believing its authority was simply a fact of galactic life, unquestioned because it had never seriously been questioned. We had just shown them, plainly and without raising our voices, that authority is only ever as real as the willingness of everyone beneath it to keep pretending it cannot be walked away from. The direct talks with the Crisari began 9 days after our walkout, in a small conference room aboard a neutral trade vessel that belonged to neither the Council nor either of our two peoples, chosen deliberately by both sides because it belonged to no authority either of us needed to answer to. There was no shortened table this time. There was no translation delay that made our words sound smaller than we meant them. There was simply a round table, built to no one species' advantage, and two delegations who had spent 3 years trying to destroy each other, now sitting down to decide, without anyone else's permission, exactly how that was going to stop. Doran Vex led the Crisari delegation himself, which surprised several of my colleagues, though it did not surprise me. He had told me plainly, in that first private conversation, that he believed we were the only two people on that station who fully understood what those 3 years had actually cost, and I think he meant it as more than a diplomatic courtesy. I think he genuinely believed that a peace built by the people who had actually fought each other would hold in a way that a peace built by outside administrators never could. The first session lasted 6 hours, and I want to be honest in saying it was not easy. There was anger in that room, old and deep and entirely justified on both sides. Grace, sitting beside me, spoke for nearly 20 minutes at one point about colonies destroyed, about families who never received bodies to bury, about a war that had cost us more than any treaty could ever properly account for, and Doran Vex did not interrupt her once, did not soften what she said or attempt to argue with it, simply listened, and when she finished, he acknowledged every single point she had made without excuse. In turn, one of his senior officers spoke of Crisari worlds that had also lost people in this war, families on their side who had also buried children, a truth that our own briefings had never fully accounted for, because we had spent 3 years thinking of the Crisari only as the aggressor and never quite as a people who were also grieving. It was not comfortable to hear. It was not meant to be comfortable, but it was honest in a way that 6 weeks of council-mediated talks had never once managed to be, and I think that honesty, more than anything else, was what eventually let both sides begin building something that might actually last. By the 3rd day of direct talks, we had reached an agreement on the core question that had derailed 6 weeks of council negotiations in a matter of hours. The contested colonies would remain under human authority, defended by human forces, exactly as they had been defended throughout the war, with no outside body inserted between our people and the ground we had bled to hold. In exchange, we agreed to a demilitarized boundary zone between our territories, jointly monitored by both our peoples directly, with no third-party administrator required at all, because Doran Vex made the same point I had made to Vantik days earlier, that the only peace worth trusting was one negotiated as equals, not one imposed by people who had never risked anything to earn a voice in it. Word of the agreement reached the council within hours of its signing, and I understand, from delegates who were present, that the reaction inside that chamber was something close to genuine panic. A war the council had refused to involve itself in for 3 years had just been resolved, completely and apparently permanently, without a single clause of council-approved language anywhere in the final document. The treaty they had spent 6 weeks carefully constructing, the one meant to place human military authority under a new regional stability command, was no longer relevant to anyone at all, because the two parties who had actually fought the war had simply written their own ending and walked away from the table that no longer served either of them. I learned later that the council convened 3 separate emergency sessions in the week following our agreement, not to discuss the treaty itself, which had become effectively meaningless the moment it was signed, but to discuss something far more troubling to them. If humanity could simply walk away from a council-mediated process and negotiate a lasting peace directly with a former enemy, without any apparent consequence, what did that mean for every other treaty the council currently administered? What did it mean for every other species currently sitting quietly at similarly shortened tables, trusting that the council's process was the only path available to them? The question that had never needed asking in 1,000 years had suddenly become impossible to avoid, and I do not believe the council had any comfortable answer for it. A representative from a species called the Yeren, a small trading people, who had sat 2 seats down from us throughout the original talks and never once spoken more than a few careful words, requested a meeting with our delegation roughly 2 weeks after the Crisari agreement was finalized. I met with her myself, expecting, I will admit, some further complication in an already complicated process. Instead, she asked a single question that told me more about what our walkout had actually done than any council session ever could. "How did you know," she asked, "that they would let you leave?" I did not answer immediately, because I wanted to give her the honest answer, rather than the confident one. "I did not know," I said. "I only knew that staying meant accepting terms my people had not actually agreed to lose the war over. Sometimes the only way to find out what happens if you refuse is to actually refuse." She was quiet for a long moment. "My people have sat at that table for 40 years, she said finally, believing there was no other option available to us. I did not tell her what to do with that information. It was not my place, and I had learned, over 3 long years of war and 6 long weeks of talks, that the value of an example is not in telling people what conclusion to draw from it, but simply in showing them that a different conclusion is possible at all. The council, to its credit, did eventually attempt something like genuine reform, though it took the better part of a year, and I do not believe it would have happened at all without the shock of watching a war resolve itself entirely outside their process. New procedural rules were introduced, giving smaller and newer member species actual voting weight rather than purely advisory status. The observer system that had ruled against us on 41 consecutive procedural questions was restructured, with new safeguards meant to prevent exactly the kind of quiet, one-sided mediation we had experienced. I do not know whether these changes were made out of genuine reflection or simple fear of losing further authority, and I suspect, if I am honest, that it was likely some combination of both. But I have come to believe that the reason behind a good change matters less than the change itself, provided the change actually holds. Vantik and I spoke one final time, roughly 6 months after the Crisari agreement, at a small reception marking the formal restructuring of the Council's procedural rules. He approached me himself, which surprised me, given how our last private conversation had ended, and his manner was different this time, quieter, stripped of the careful performance I had watched him maintain for 6 long weeks. "I have thought a great deal," he said, "about what you told me in that meeting." "Which part?" "That authority is only as real as the willingness of everyone beneath it to keep pretending it cannot be walked away from." He said the words carefully, as though he had turned them over many times since I first spoke them. "I did not believe you when you said it. I believed the Council's authority rested on something more solid than mere agreement. And now?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the gathered delegates from a dozen species, many of whom, I noticed, now spoke with a confidence I had not seen in that original chamber 6 months earlier. "Now," he said, "I believe you understood something about power that 1,000 years of governance somehow never taught us, that it only exists as long as the people beneath it believe leaving costs more than staying. You proved otherwise, Ambassador, in front of every species at that table, and I do not believe this council will ever fully recover the assumption it operated under for 1,000 years, that its authority was simply a fact of galactic life rather than a choice everyone continued making." I did not gloat, and I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy, in that moment, to feel something like triumph. I did not feel triumph. I felt, instead, something closer to a quiet, settled understanding of everything those 3 years and 6 weeks had actually cost, and everything they had ultimately taught, not just to humanity, but to a council that had never before had reason to question its own foundation. "Counselor," I said, "I did not walk away from that table to teach the council a lesson. I walked away because my people had already paid a price no treaty should have asked us to pay twice. If the council learned something from watching us refuse, I am glad, but it was never the purpose, it was only ever the result." I think about that conversation often, even now, years later, sitting in my own small office on a rebuilt colony that no longer needs anyone's permission to defend itself. Laura Bishop still runs her school there, and the children who study under its wide, bright windows have never once had to seal themselves into a shelter built for a tenth their number. Marcus Hale still flies, though these days it is mostly cargo runs and training flights, and he laughs when I ask him at how strange it is to fly over Farron's Reach now and see nothing but quiet farmland where a battle once stretched 11 impossible days. Doran Vex and I still speak, occasionally, through channels that exist now because two peoples who once tried to destroy each other decided, in the end, that a peace built by equals was worth more than a peace handed down by anyone who had never risked anything to earn a place in it. I do not know if I would call us friends exactly, but I think we understand each other in a way that few people from opposing sides of a war ever get the chance to understand one another, and I have come to believe that understanding is worth more than any treaty language could ever properly capture. As for the Council, it still governs, still mediates, still sits at the center of 1,000 quiet agreements between 100 different species scattered across the dark between the stars. But it governs differently now, I am told, more carefully, more honestly, because it learned, on a single ordinary day, inside a chamber with a table too short for the people sitting at it, that its authority was never quite as solid as it had always assumed. It learned that a species does not need permission to survive, and does not need permission to walk away from a table that has stopped serving the purpose it was built for. I think, sometimes, of that first day back at the talks, the cold click of the translator in my ear, Vantik's smile that was not built for smiling, the shorter table, the careful, practiced condescension of people who had written us off long before they ever agreed to sit across from us. I think of how close we came, in that chamber, to accepting terms that would have cost us everything those 3 years had already paid for. And I think of the single, quiet decision that changed the shape of everything that followed. Not a shout, not a threat, simply a woman closing a datapad and standing, and a room full of people who had never once imagined that we would actually leave, discovering all at once exactly how wrong they had been. We did not walk away from peace that day. We walked away from a peace that assumed we would always be the ones asked to give something up. And in doing so, we finally taught a 1,000-year-old council the one lesson it had never needed to learn before, that the galaxy does not belong only to those who write its rules. It belongs, in the end, to those who refuse to accept a seat smaller than the one they have already earned.